Welcome to Long Story Short, a podcast where two financial advisors, one rooted in financial planning, the other in investment strategy, break down the questions we're actually hearing from our clients. Each episode, we tackle one or two real-world issues that matter to high net worth individuals, from market-moving news to personal finance decisions with lasting impact. No jargon, no fluff, just clear, thoughtful insights from the front lines of wealth management. We keep it short, but we don't cut corners. This is Long Story Short.
All right, Andy, to kick things off, I'm going to ask you a question. This is the no shame zone. Can you tell me a time when you personally have tried to over-optimize something in your life, no matter how ridiculous it is?
Yes, let me tell you. So my family has played a betting game for years, basically my entire life. And it's fake money. You get a fake $1,000 at the start of the NFL season. And then you have to bet on games all season long, and whoever has the most money at the end of the game wins. So, I mean, I've tried every which way to try to figure out, what NFL teams are poised to outperform, where is their value in the lines, to the point where I'm like making these crazy Excel models to try to do this.
Yeah.
And guess what? The person who always wins it is like my aunt who watches 3 games a year. That's it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I've done a lot of over optimizing in my life.
Okay. That's a good one. Something I did not know about you. So learn something new every day. I was having this conversation with a client the other week. We were talking about the concept of over optimization and when, analysis paralysis, kind of all comes together and we overthink things. And there's this curve of which analyzing something to an extreme starts to have benefits that move against your objective. Whether it's, I was trying to think of common ways this applies outside of finance, but people who are counting calories on diets and weighing their food and like the fatigue that comes with doing that over and over again. People with their fantasy football teams and trying to get everything perfect.
Oh, yeah.
People with anything, right? I mean, you could
March Madness,
parenting. Like people. There's just
guilty of that.
You
sure.
can, I mean, being young parents, both of us, reading all these parenting books, and I think the world of easy access to information has only compounded this. But before we talk about what this means in the context of investing and financial planning, I tried to think through and was talking through with this client, what are some instances, what are some side effects of this? As we're kind of talking through the pros and cons of trying to get every single little decision perfect, hitting the bullseye. And, I think the common underlying theme in over-optimization or over-analyzing something is fatigue, right? Eventually it wears you out, and eventually you realize that you can't control things to the extent that you probably want to. There's all these external factors in whatever you're looking at that will, rear their head and put you in a position where you feel like you can't control or optimize the way that you want to. And I think with our clients and with the money, money is, we talk all the time about money being like this very personal thing that impacts almost everything we do. We spend years and years saving and investing and watching the markets, and there's all this information at our fingertips now. And, sometimes we want to be able to count things down to the penny. We want to know exactly what the market's going to do every year. We want to know, especially if you're doing a financial plan and you're forecasting decades into the future, you want to know what type of portfolio withdrawal you're going to need in 2053, right? Or how much you're going to leave your kids and to when, right? Do you notice the same thing in your, like, we've all run into this in our personal lives, but, in the context of personal finance, right? Like, let's talk through this. Is this something you've seen in working with clients or had to coach people through?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's amazing to me sometimes how precise someone will say, I need returns to be X, right? Like down to the decimal. because they've done some math on the back end, and for them to achieve whatever they want to achieve, like that's the minimum acceptable return that they need. And yeah, you could drive yourself crazy and end up making like self-destructive decisions if you're so focused on, this very specific thing that you need to have. Yeah, so this is certainly something I see through the context of like investing. It happens all the time, right? If let's just say that, like, I'll give a tangible example of this. Let's just say that, you think you need 12.3% returns, right, to be able to
Hmm.
achieve your financial goals. And maybe it's a little bit optimistic, but maybe the stock market can achieve that. But then you have a year where just the stock market doesn't do anything and it's flat, right? And so now you're making changes to your portfolio, right? You're like, well, I need to boost returns. I need to increase risk. We're going to go to high yield bonds. We're going to go to cryptocurrencies. We're going to really reach for risk here. And that ultimately leads to maybe even a worse allocation than you had before. When the truth is, all you have to do is stick around, keep the faith, and stay invested, right? So yeah, this is something that comes up. I'm not saying every client's guilty of this, but I certainly do see it from time to time.
Well, especially when you think about it in the context of like long-term planning and retirement. If you ask someone who's lived a very successful retirement, they've spent what they've wanted to spend, spent time with family, they've traveled, however they define, their perfect retirement. If you ask them later in life what made that successful, how many of them would ever say it was my 12.2% return, or it was that I nailed my tax bill 30 years in advance, or that I knew down to the penny every year what I was going to have to spend and my budget was perfect. Like, I've never had that conversation with a client where they've looked back and said, the reason why I lived the life I did, I had the success I had in an uncertain period of life was because all this analysis I did and all this bullseye level optimization that I conjured up got me to where I want to be.
Yeah. I mean, I think generally speaking, like the pursuit of perfection might sound great, right? Like, I'm going to try to create the perfect prediction for my financial plan. I need to nail the inflation assumption, the return assumption, my spending assumption, my future earnings assumption. There's all these things. And if you try to do that perfectly, like that just seems like you're setting yourself up for failure, right? Because is it possible to even hit any one of those things perfectly,
No,
much less all of them?
no, no. And that puts us in a interesting position when you're having these long-term conversations with clients. We know at the end of the day, what's the formula to a successful plan long term, over many, many years. It's, spend less than you make, save, invest in a portfolio that meets, your long-term return objectives and needs, and stay invested. So don't make any knee-jerk moves in and out of the market. Manage your costs. Be mindful of taxes and utilize, whatever the IRS will give you in terms of potential tax saving strategies, and stay with, define what guardrails look like in that context in terms of what you can spend based on what you've accumulated and the tools that you have in your toolbox, and just don't get out of the sandbox. And, that's, the thing about our role as advisors, it's not to be, we're not, I'm trying to think of like a great analogy to this, but, we're not here to make everyone perfectionists. We are essentially, if you think of it, like a teacher at recess, right? Like there's a playground and you're exploring and you're there and you're bouncing around from activity to activity, trying to do the best you can. And we're just making sure people stay in the playground. Like that's ultimately at the end of the day, our role is making sure that our clients stay within the boundaries that make the most sense for them. And as long as you're within that box, you've got a lot of flexibility in terms of what you can do. But even when we're looking at numbers 15, 20 years down the road, we know that there's uncertainty attached to them, but we know enough in our experience to be able to say, like, you're still on the playground. Like, right, you're still, You're still within the bands of what we think is going to lead you to success.
You don't need anyone, climbing the outside of the tunnel slide and possibly falling off and breaking an arm, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
because you see that in a portfolio or I think this was a common thing that happened in as recently as like the early 2020s where, fixed income was yielding next to nothing. And so people were like, well, I need this return. And so now they're taking risk in places where they don't need to be taking risk, right?
Yeah.
Like from the bond part of the portfolio. So yeah, you see that, and I think that like you do have to be like directionally accurate, right? Like certainly I'd say you don't want to build a financial plan that's, reliant on a return assumption of like 20% in a
No.
portfolio, right? Right. So you need to be, and perhaps you also need to like take into account context, right? Like if we are in a place where we think that valuations might be a little stretched, that, maybe you don't want to assume average returns, or if you're in a place where like, returns haven't been good for a while and things look undervalued, like maybe it's okay to factor in a little bit higher returns, but like you just need to be directionally accurate. And if the exact percentage doesn't come to fruition, at the end of the day, that's fine. I'm curious though, like, would you recommend people, like if they're making like planning assumptions, how close to accurate would you want to be? Would you rather err on the side of caution, or would you just kind of use like historical norms?
That's our approach is always going to be from a planning perspective, especially when you're looking decades into the future, to err on the side of being conservative. Because a lot of long-term planning, you're making a decision on where you're willing to be wrong and what you're willing to adjust for in those assumptions over time. For example, if I look at the average return of the stock market over the last 100 years, it's going to tell me it was 10-ish%. So if I have someone with a slightly more aggressive portfolio, they're retiring. If I want to assume a 9-10% return over many decades, you're putting a lot of pressure on your plan to achieve those results, to live within your level of freedom. If you use lower return assumptions, higher inflation rates, and you kind of stress test your spending against those, then you start to develop a look at what those guardrails can actually be. So even if you run a plan assuming a 5-6% return and 3% inflation, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what your portfolio is designed to do, but it shows you in the event that returns are less exciting than they have been historically. If inflation runs a little bit higher, then you can create a market environment that would be historically pretty poor and see if your plan lives through it. And then that just gives you context of making life decisions. So whether it's the
Curious
inflation,
about this.
yeah,
Yeah. So like on that, so obviously like you want to be a little conservative with your planning assumptions. Do you think there's any value into doing like really extreme stress tests, like absolute worst case scenario?
psychologically, yeah, right? I mean, I guess you would have to ask someone how do you define a worst case scenario? I will ask that question sometimes and I'm amazed at the answers I get. For a lot of people, if it's portfolio focused, they'll say 2008, because that's just in the last 50 years.
That's the big one, the
That's the
memorable one.
real
Yeah.
big, like prolonged
It's
market crash.
it's more recent than the Great Depression. Yeah.
Exactly. So if it's market related, they'll say that, and we can show them what it looks like. If you stopped working tomorrow or were living off of your portfolio and '08 happened all over again, what might this do to your plan? Other things could be a major health event, or if they have to start supporting their parents or their children full time. Everyone's worst case scenario will be outside of the general stock market scenarios, will be circumstantial and more life driven events. But that's really what planning, if you think about what long term planning's for, it's not so much trying to determine down to the penny what every year is going to look like over the next 40, 50 years. It's really, okay, what can really throw this off track? And then what's a great scenario? Like if things are really, really great, what does that look like? If things are really, really poor, what does that look like? And know that the reality will likely fall somewhere between, and just have a plan in place to, especially in that tougher scenario of what you're going to do and what you're going to adjust and how you're going to account for life in the event that that happens. So that's really, if you boil it down, that is a different exercise than sitting down and making, our engineer clients will laugh, people like, hey, like I'm personally guilty of this as well. So I'm allowed to say this, right? But you make a spreadsheet that goes out 10, 15 years with lots of numbers, and it feels good to go through that exercise. So it might be psychologically soothing to get into that detail and create some certainty by creating a spreadsheet or looking at numbers. But the reality is there's too many external variables to get it perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, on that topic of spreadsheets, I've been using Copilot a little bit in my Excel work. It
Yeah.
is amazing. You just type in, this is what I want to do with this data set, and it spits it out. I'm sure it could give me a pretty precise prediction for future returns.
Yeah. Yeah. Tools like
If
that
it
are only
really
going to
wanted
make it
to.
more dangerous. The
Yeah.
over optimizers they've now been armed with all of these AI tools that are rapidly growing so that you can run more scenarios and more numbers, again, all different types of potential outcomes. But again, this is why we always say that planning it's a year-round sport. It's a long game, and it's about focus, prioritization, focusing on what are the things this year and the next couple of years that are of absolute importance and I need to make sure I get right. And then knowing that over many, many decades, things will change and that we just have to be prepared and have the tools available to adjust everything else if and when that happens. I've had too many clients say, I'm going to retire on this date. And then a year later, they go back to work, or they said, I'm going to spend this much, and they end up spending something substantially different, or they think the tax code's going one way, but it goes another way. They think their kids are going to be self-sufficient by the time they're 30, and now they're paying rent on top of the mortgage for the second home they bought in retirement. There's too many things that can happen. The advisor is the referee, if you want to use a sports analogy. We all watched a lot of terrible football this past weekend.
The Commanders came out on top. So, I'm riding a little high here.
Okay, well, one of us at least is. But the referee, they let you play the game, but they know when to kind of pause things and reset the playing field, and that's our job, and that's why over optimization, although while fun and could be an interesting exercise for our math oriented clients and people who like to tweak that part of their brain and get it working every now and then, the reality is that there's a lot of fatigue that can come with it, and it could cause a lot of undue stress if you're trying to nail these perfect numbers over time. And it's not realistic because life's going to change. And the external factors in the investment world are really going to change, like valuations.
Well, that's great advice. So maybe I'll rely a little less on Ken Palm metrics next March Madness. Fewer metrics, I think, are better. One metric, as you point out, valuations. One of my favorite things about like this job in this industry is every now and then there is some absolute niche indicator that I'm sure someone's talking about on Zero Hedge or talking about on Reddit, or some famous hedge fund manager is yelling about some cleverly named indicator.
Yeah.
I just find it endlessly entertaining. Just how creative people can be with this stuff.
There are so many of them. Before we get to some of the more popular ones, what are some crazy out of the left field indicators you've seen?
So I'd say like the Shiller Cape ratio is something you heard a lot about.
A popular
in
one.
Like
yeah.
the 2010s.
Yeah.
It reminds me of like, who was it? Edna Mode from The Incredibles saying, no capes, no capes.
He was on TV all the time.
Yeah, he was. but the CAPE ratio essentially was this valuation similar to a PE ratio, but Dr. Schiller is the one who created it. And it basically has said since the financial crisis that stocks are overvalued. Basically 99% of the time since the financial crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I have to tell anyone on this webinar or this podcast that stocks have done pretty well since 2008, right? Like once you got through the financial crisis. So that's one kind of a cautionary tale. I'd hate to be the guy who would just never in the stock market because the CAPE ratio said not to be.
Yeah, and that's
Do you have any others?
That's a normal one. That's a good one. That's like at least a semi-respected indicator.
You're looking more for like the big back indicator.
Well,
right?
I'm gonna butcher this. I'm gonna butcher this, and I'm hoping you know. I'm hoping you know like the real, the more the meat behind this one. But it was something to do about the years in which the Eagles win the Super Bowl. It's a terrible year for stocks. So like 2018, they won the Super Bowl. Am I getting that right? And that ended up being we had a really big bear market at the end of the year. And then they won the Super Bowl last year and we survived. So that indicator.
So far. Here we go. CNBC, February 8th, 2025. Could an Eagles Super Bowl victory tank the stock market?
Yeah. Oh, and they won with this February. Yeah, that goes to show you where my football now. This is how tuned out of football I am. So they just won this past February. They won the Super Bowl, right? I got that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so we're 9 months.
I mean, you kind of grew up in Philadelphia, right? I know you're not an Eagles fan, but you should know this stuff.
I should. I'm a little embarrassed, but I'm probably the only non-Eagles fan to ever come out of Philly. But so we're almost 9 months.
Real quick, before we get it, did you see that Eagles fan, that woman who like went and stole the baseball from that kid?
Horrible. Yeah, that was terrible. That's really embarrassing. I don't know who would do that. That was bad. Yeah. I feel like that united America that moment, seeing that middle-aged woman steal the baseball from the young kid. So
right, that was next level.
Yes, yeah. That's at least in my experience. That's not a good indicator of the people of Philly. The city of brotherly love is better than that. I can promise you. But
I believe you.
So everyone thought that this year, coming off of 2 strong years, 23 and 24, that the market was really going to take a dive. So we're at least most of the way through this year, and people are still going to cross their fingers the last few months of the year. But that was one, like stuff like that, I think is a different level.
I got one on that level too. You know, we've done this before, the Santa Claus rally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the whole idea that it's the last 5 trading days of the current year and the first 2 of the new year see above average returns.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's one of these like calendar anomalies that exist out there. And like to the point, if you want to talk about over optimization, I created a regression model to predict, what kind of years predict better or worse Santa Claus rallies. And it kind of looks like a U, right? So like if on really bad years, there's this like strong Santa Claus rally. And then on really good years, there's this strong Santa Claus rally. And then we started like actually monitoring it and maybe even trying to like trade on it a little bit. And guess what? The anomaly totally went away. Totally went away. I don't think our predicted number has ever come to fruition.
Most of them do get traded away. And I think that's the key takeaway before you reveal the one that the indicator anomaly that clients are really asking us about these days. It's really the undertone of all of this is that while interesting and, sometimes funny, sometimes exciting, sometimes academic, that these are anomalies and these indicators are not things you can reliably trade on. Is that fair? Like, we'll put that disclaimer right up front that you do not want to trade based on this.
Yeah, no, certainly not. I mean, there's all sorts of like context. We were just talking about last week, the fact that, the reason why stock markets are pretty rational as far as price discovery is it's the combined opinion of millions of investors who literally put their money where their mouth is, right? When it comes to investing. So, there's always more to it than any one number can distill down. But the thing that I have started hearing from clients in really recent weeks, it's kind of come to a little bit of crescendo, is generally about valuations. And like the specific indicator that I was talking about in the past week is called the Warren Buffett indicator. I mean, that sounds pretty good. Warren Buffett, what is he, the most successful investor of all time?
Yeah, that comes with a gold stamp, right? You hear anything with Buffett's name attached to it, and it immediately
Yeah.
gets a lot of respect, and I get that. But this one is, what is it? What is the Buffett indicator?
So the Buffett indicator is super simple. It's the overall value of the stock market, total market cap of the stock market, right? Every single publicly traded stock divided by the US GDP. Right? And so basically what the thesis here is that the stock market is going to be tied to economic activity. So that's GDP. And so if the stock market is less than the GDP of the country, then stocks are really undervalued. But if it's more than the value of the economy, then stocks are really overvalued, right? And so generally speaking, like a level of like 100% would be like, okay, we're at fair value because
Right.
there's a match between these two sides. If we're at 50%, things are undervalued. We're at 150%, things are overvalued. And so the thing that I think has people worried is this Buffett indicator has tilted, not to 110, not to 120, not to 150, but it's at 215%. So, the value of the overall stock market is significantly higher than US GDP. And so people are taking that and saying, hey, things are crazy overvalued because this is, more than 2 standard deviations above normal. Stocks are expensive and things are scary.
Yeah.
That's basically what I'm hearing.
So what holes can you poke in this? Like what would you say, just based on that indicator alone, what are some things to calm clients and listeners?
Yeah. So like I said, like indicators like this, I think it was in 2001, Warren Buffett said, this is probably the single best measure of where valuations are at any given moment. 2001, he said this kind of, during the dot-com bubble burst. And that's when it was right, by the way. Like in the dot-com bubble, this ratio looked overvalued. Then obviously we know what happened when that bubble burst, right? We had the lost decade in stocks in the 2000s. And so people remember that. It's scary. Buffett's saying this is a great indicator. But I think there's really 4 reasons that things are really different today versus at other times in history, and why this signal may not be telling us what we think it is just right off the cuff. So for one, globalization, right? So I think this is like a big problem with this model is think about how many companies in the US, like they're not just selling their products to US consumers. Right. These are global multinational companies, right? I mean, I think there's estimates where roughly 40% of S&P 500 sales occur outside of the US.
Right.
Right. So if you're using the stock market and you're tying it to US economic activity, well, that ignores the fact that the stocks are baking in prices, in future earnings of companies based on what they're selling in Europe and Japan and China and India and all these places where there's billions more people, right? So it might be a little foolhardy to tie this all to just the U.S. economy, just because we are more multinational now, even with all this chatter about tariffs. I think honestly that's part of the reason why the tariff, just back in April, why that was such a temper tantrum from the market was because so much of the earnings of these companies are baked in from success that they're doing overseas. But to tie it back to this indicator, right? Like you would need to broaden things out. It'd probably be more accurate to say the value of the stock market compared to the global economy than just the U.S. economy, right? So things should be higher. We just companies do more international sales now than they've ever done before. The second thing, and this might be a little bit esoteric, so bear with me, but there are so many more intangible assets today that really aren't properly captured by GDP and with corporate accounting practices, at least not in the US. So you have things like intellectual property, right? Copyrights, things like that. You've got brand value, right? So like Beats by Dre, right? That has some value to it that's not accounted for. You have even things like software oftentimes aren't really being accounted for because these are considered intangible assets. So it's almost like there's these like invisible, it's kind of like dark matter, things that are out there that aren't being captured by the rules that we currently have in place to measure economic activity, but you probably should. And so like I've seen estimates where, again, it's going to be a number that's like 40% of the value of some companies, especially the biggest companies, are actually intangible assets. And that's just not properly being accounted for by this metric. And I'll say, the third one here is interest rates. So just the fact of the matter that we're, even now with interest rates a little bit higher than they were back in the early 2020s, we're still in relatively low interest rate type environment. And so and the expectation is that interest rates are going to be cut a little bit from here. So lower interest rates actually can justify and sustain higher valuations. That's just how the math works when you're trying to do time value money type work and predict the future stream of earnings of companies, which is ultimately what a stock market is doing. It's discounting that future stream of earnings back to today, and that's how it determines the price. So if interest rates are lower, then higher valuations can be supported just based on that math. And finally, the last point I'll make is that if we just look at the market composition, a big part of this value is really tied up in like 7 stocks.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so like we know the Magnificent Seven stocks, they're really all, quite frankly, unicorn companies where they've grown at incredibly fast rates. They're incredibly profitable companies. I mean, they're high quality companies that you probably want to own in your portfolio. Right. But at the same time, they're really big in terms of overall percentage. They're something like 35% of the S&P 500 right now. And they just happen to be pricier than the typical stocks. So if you take those out and you just measure the PE ratio at the bottom, 493, then you get a much more like reasonable kind of long-term norm type number. So I think those are really the 4 things that, why the Buffett ratio, while it may seem scary at first, may not be accurately, predicting what you think it's predicting.
So the key theme there is there's a lot, especially in your second and third point, is there's a lot of things that are reflected in the stock price, which makes those companies more attractive from a long-term hold perspective, but are not reflected in GDP. Things like intellectual property, brand power, foreign revenues, right? Like they are captured in the stock price movements, but not necessarily in the reporting in the GDP figures.
Right.
Really interesting, all great points and things to keep in mind. Let me play devil's advocate for a second, because even if it's
Sure.
not the Buffett indicator, you look at like a very standard PE ratio of the market, and you slice that up other ways. Look at price to sales, price to book, right? Any way you cut up the composition of the market now, the reality is you are going to get an output that does show you that stock prices are elevated relative to history. However, I remember, and you remember, that there's many times where this has been the case, but stocks have continued to do really well. So it's not an indication of what's going to happen in the short term, but what are some things we can talk through where we can acknowledge that, like the market is pricey relative to history, but why that shouldn't be something to send people running for the hills or going to cash? What are some things that you would really point
Well,
out to?
there's the famous saying here where the stock market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent.
Mm.
Right. And so to me, that comes to mind whenever we're talking market timing. So I'll say that I absolutely will acknowledge that, I mean, valuations, especially in the US, do look pricey. Right. And there's, at least I think people are quite frankly right to be concerned about that to an extent. But my counterpoint there is, let's say that, okay, fine, I think stocks are expensive. And then you think that stocks are going to fall in value, right? Because they're expensive. But then what if you're wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, this is what people have been saying, for a long time, that things are too expensive. I heard when I started in 2012, I heard people talking about how the stock market was too expensive.
Oh, sure.
Even back then. And if you were, and maybe one day you'll be right and there'll be some big bear market and you can say, I told you so, but that might be 10, 15 years in the future.
Right.
And by that point in time, you'll have missed out on all these gains. So, I would say that you definitely want to make sure that you're not letting any of these metrics alter what you're doing too much. But if you're the type of person who sees this and you're like, maybe you've got some cash on the sidelines and you're saying, hey, I want to get this invested, there's a couple things I would think about. For one, you're worried about stocks in the US. There's other things you can invest in besides stocks in the US, right? There's international stocks. And, let's use the same Buffett ratio. If you really buy the Buffett ratio, stocks overseas are looking even under 100%. I think I looked it up. Germany's stock market, the Buffett ratio is 44%. In China, it's 63%, right? So maybe it's not shocking that we're seeing international stocks do well this year, but if you're looking for value, maybe it makes sense to allocate internationally, right? I think that would be good hygiene and just generally good practice. Number two, the stock market is not just the top 7 stocks in the US. And so if you're looking for an investment strategy that can potentially generate returns, even if the big stocks lag, then I think it's going to be really important to invest in something that has the flexibility to lean value, to lean more into small caps when the timing is right. I'll say that momentum is a really powerful force in investing, and it's definitely possible to be too early on one of these types of moves. So, I would suggest, momentum in the stock market in the US, despite these valuations, is strong. I'd say ride that wave as long as you can. But then if there is signs of weakness, and this is something that we will do in our investment strategy, right? If we're seeing signs of weakness out of those, top heavy stocks, then yeah, we'll absolutely go down market to where there might be a little bit more value. But we just know, because our investment strategy is size and solid responsive. We know from years and years and years of tilting portfolios, growth, value, small, large, that valuations alone are a terrible predictor of what's going to happen, right? It's good context to have, maybe over a 10-year prediction. But you can definitely make bad moves and make moves that are way too early and miss out on a lot of returns if you overreact to them. So I would say keep those things in mind. It's not just, the Max 7 out there. There's other things you can invest in too. And kind of, don't let the Max 7 stocks cloud your judgment over just stock market investing more generally.
No, absolutely. I'm just, I remember back, you said 2012. I literally remember going to a webinar back in 2015. I remember this because I still have a picture of this chart they pulled up during the webinar. And it was in 2015 trying to forecast 10-year returns for the market based on various valuation metrics. And it was and it was across various different investment shops. And they were all saying low single, mid single digit returns. And look what happened. Even with the kind of headwinds we saw the last few years, the market still fought through a lot of those headwinds. And if you go back the last 100 years, I know we talk about the average return of the S&P being 10-ish% per year over time. But if you plot out every year and the return by year, very few of those years, if any, it's a return actually 10%. It's usually something.
The return is never the average return.
Right. It never hovers around the average. It's usually it could be really prolonged periods of above average returns and then prolonged periods of, sell-offs and below average returns. So don't be fooled by the average. The ride to get there looks a lot different through time. And, these indicators, as we say, they're not great. They aren't great short-term predictors of what the market's going to do at all, Andy. Just to point out, like what you said about momentum, that's a great reason to point to. But, over the long run, things do revert back to their averages, and that's really where balance comes into play. And being smart with planning and not trying to over-optimize what's going to happen every single year or month. Now I'm hearing a lot about September being a poor month. And, there's always going to be the anomaly du jour that we're worried about.
Du jour.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
That wraps things up. We've got some great questions and feedback from clients. Don't forget the email address is long story short, one word there, @Bernie.com. We love the questions. Keep them coming, and we'll see you next week.
This podcast featured Adam Newman and Andy Pratt of Bernie Wealth Management, which is a division of the Bernie Company, an investment advisory firm. Adam is managing partner and is chartered financial analyst, certified financial planner, master of taxation, and retirement income certified professional. And Andy is senior partner and director of investment strategy and is a chartered financial analyst and chartered alternative investment analyst. Long story short involves general discussions of a broad range of current financial topics related to financial planning, taxes, investment, and retirement. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as personalized investment advice or recommendation. It does not take into account your financial situation. You'll need to consult with a qualified financial advisor or professional who's familiar with your specific circumstances. Investing involves risks, and past performance is not indicative of future results. The Bernie Company is an SEC-registered investment advisor. Registration with the SEC or any state securities authority does not apply to the Bernie Company or any of its principals or employees, possesses a particular level of skill or training in the investment advisory business or any other business. Bernie Company does not provide legal, tax, or accounting advice, but offers it through third parties. Before making any financial decisions, clients should consult their legal and/or tax advisors.